Each of the identities that we occupy carries with it some intrinsic level of privilege that is often unrecognized and unacknowledged. On this episode of Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, Fiona Oliphant, Esquire, helps us to understand our hidden privilege and why is it important to apply it to help us dismantle systemic racism on our common journey forward. This episode originally aired July 14th, 2021.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everybody here. Welcome to another episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. I am Eugene Holden, the co-host here. And I again want to welcome you to Race Talk. Of course, this is where your voice matters. Just real fast, today we will be speaking with Fiona Oliphant, and our discussion today is dismantling systemic racism, a common journey forward. Ms. Oliphant Esquire is the co-founder and co-director of the equity and inclusion consulting firm, Healing Equity United. So today what we will be discussing is the responsibility we all share for dismantling this systemic racism and the responsibility that each of us has for acknowledging and managing the privilege intrinsic in our individual identities to create change. I want to let you know that there's a spoiler alert here. In our conversation today, you might discover that you have more privilege than you thought you had. So let me just go over some of the logistics that we do every week. During our conversation, please remain muted. If you have a question, you raise your hand. And again, I'll go over this when we get to the Q&A. But how you raise your hand is you scroll down to the bottom of your screen to reactions. When you click on that, there's a raise hand button. Make sure you do that. Also, you may put your questions and comments in the chat box. Now, please try to keep your questions and your comments under a minute so that we can allow as many people as possible to get their questions answered and also to give Ms. Oliphant time to answer. Just a really friendly reminder here, right, that Race Talk Revolution is a loving, respectful, and inclusive platform. We are designed to encourage constructive dialogue around these tough issues that pertain to racial and social injustice. This is a safe space for people of all backgrounds to share ideas and opinions and to explore the nuances of systemic racism and to grow our anti-racism muscles. In our Race Talk community, we practice radically inclusive love. Like I like to say, loving no matter what, loving unconditionally, which means I love no matter what that person says or doesn't say, do or doesn't do. And that's what we that's what we strive to be here at Race Talk Revolution. Even when we don't understand or agree with what's being shared, we listen with respect, appreciation, and empathy. Our commitment is that every person be encouraged, every person be heard, and every person be appreciated. You know why? Because on Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, every voice matters. My co-host, Reverend Lane Cobb.
Good day, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome to our first timers today. We have some first timers in the house. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us this afternoon. I am happy to have the honor of introducing our guest today. Fiona Oliphant Esquire is the co-founder and co-director of Healing Equity United, an equity consulting firm. Her personal mission is to create a world which centers those living in the margins of our society by valuing their lived experiences, amplifying their voices, and realigning current systems of power. Ms. Oliphant has extensive experience facilitating workshops pertaining to a variety of topics, including but not limited to cultural humility, deconstructing oppression, racial equity, radical healing, and unpacking bias. She has also worked with numerous organizations to move beyond superficial checkbox actions towards substantive, enduring culture change. With almost 2 decades of experience working in the gender-based violence sector, she has been an intern, legal advocate, program manager, staff attorney, trainer, public speaker, and director. Prior to working independently, Fiona served as the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Community Engagement for the DC Coalition to End Sexual Violence. She was also the Director of the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project, as well as Director of Connect's Legal Advocacy Program. An unwavering optimist, she firmly believes that our identities are sources of strength, ingenuity, and connection, and that collectively we can end violence and oppression. So Ms. Oliphant, welcome, welcome. One of the points that you make is that each of us has at some point perpetuated or at least been complicit in systemic racism, either knowingly or unknowingly. And therefore that we share responsibility for dismantling it, hence that common journey forward. Another point is that each of us occupies multiple identities and that each of those identities holds some intrinsic privilege or power that we need to be responsible for. And as conscious citizens, we are, if we're committed to change, you suggest that we should be asking ourselves two questions. One is, how are we showing up for others in a way that marginalizes them? And the other is, how do we leverage our privilege to uplift those people who have been marginalized? So if you would, take it away. So happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. And by the way, I need you to provide that synopsis everywhere I go, because you've boiled it down very neatly into what usually takes several days of intense conversation to really get to the root of. So first, let me just say hello. Welcome to everyone. I am so happy to see your faces and to see real faces. I'm usually speaking to blank boxes on Zoom lately, so I'm really happy to see your faces. I'm seeing that some of you are in New York, Maryland, DC, California. You're all over, so welcome and thank you for inviting me into this space to share time with you. Both Lane and Eugene gave you a bit of my background, but I would like to add something else that's really important to me in terms of doing this work, and that is to lead with my identities so that you are more familiar with how I come into this space, how society usually views me, treats me, and some of the associated experiences that I might have due to those identities. So first and foremost, I am a first-generation Jamaican American. My parents are Jamaican. People in my family range from being completely undocumented to naturalized citizens. And so growing up, I was profoundly impacted and aware of the oppression that immigrants in this society face, particularly those who are without documentation. On the other hand, I'm a US citizen. I was born here. And so I understand that with that identity, I hold an extreme amount of power and privilege. I cannot be removed or deported from the United States, right? And so I always ask myself, how can I use and leverage that identity in solidarity with immigrant folks? So that's one thing you should know about me in terms of my identity. Another thing is, I mentioned that I was born and raised in New York. I actually come from a borough called the Bronx. And within the Bronx, I come from a section of the Bronx called the South Bronx. And my community was almost exclusively Black and brown, right? And so when I was growing up, we had some intersecting issues going on. Of a community that was, predominantly of the global majority, right? Higher rates of poverty, higher rates of crime, and higher rates of drug use, all of which intersected to really form a unique type of oppression that most, I would dare say all in my community faced. On the other hand, I'm an attorney. I'm barred in New York and Washington, DC. And so regardless of all of the bad lawyer jokes that are out there, right? I know that the ability to put ESQ behind my last name certainly opens a lot of doors for me and grants my voice an added sense of value in most parts of this society. One other thing that I would say about my identities is that I am married to a cisgender. Oh, shout out to Stephanie in the chat. Raised in the Bronx, born in Harlem. We have to connect. And I'm married to a cisgender white male who is a European immigrant, right? And so the juxtaposition of a variety of things, right? His whiteness to my blackness, his maleness to my femaleness, and gendered and how we're treated in the society. His European immigrant hood to, you know, the immigrants that I knew who were all Black and brown, and how his immigration story significantly differed from everyone else's that I knew. And so we have really intense and nuanced conversations about that on a daily basis, right? What is the impact of his trickle-down white male privilege onto me, right? And how is that interconnected with a really warped sense of gender and ownership in the society? If I'm standing within 3 feet of him, there is a sense of, oh, she belongs to him, and therefore we treat her differently, right? And so there are a variety of things to unpack in that interaction. We have 3 biracial children, half Black, half white. And my eldest recently told me that she no longer considers herself biracial. She is a Black woman with a white father. She has never had any of his privilege, has never been mistakenly granted or issued any of his privilege. She's always been treated as a Black woman in this society, and therefore that's how she defines herself. And I always want to respect that. So I wanted to bring that up here. So we have conversations with them about racism and colorism and how that shows up in the society. So I hope that by me sharing some of my identities, you see how, you know, I bring a lot of different facets to this work. But I don't think that we should ever lose the overarching purpose of the work to our personal and individual stories. Our individual stories and experiences and identities are just a small part of what is an overarching system that we move throughout the day, right? So that's just a little bit about me and my identities. I think, Lane, you asked me to share a bit about how I came to this work, and then really diving more deeply into privilege and our identities and where we hold power and privilege, as well as where we might face oppression in this society in order to then dismantle systemic oppression ultimately, right? So, okay. I do want to ask questions throughout, because I don't want this to be a snooze fest with me just talking at you. So there will be points where I'm going to ask folks to unmute and just let's have a conversation. Yeah, great. So I, as you mentioned, had worked in the anti-violence sector for a bit over 20 years. And I held a variety of roles. And there was one consistent factor, regardless of the role that I held, was that the folks who were providing the services seemed to have significantly different lived experiences than those who were receiving the services. And there was a disconnect in terms of approaches and lived experiences and what could be deemed like cultural humility and accessibility. I also found that as I became more advanced and senior in my career, there were fewer and fewer people who looked like me at the decision-making table, right? But here we are making decisions for people who look like me, okay? There were no feedback mechanisms to inform our decision-making. It was, you know, those who were best suited to make the decisions were making the decisions, and that was that. I also found that many from mainstream organizations were soliciting my help in terms of enhancing their service provision. Why? Because at the time when this first began, I was an attorney providing immigration representation to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And many people were shocked at how diverse my client portfolio was. I had Afghani folks, I had, folks from all over the African continent. I had folks from the Caribbean. I had folks from Central and South America. I had Asian folks, like all over. And the question repeatedly was, well, how are you getting them to come to your office? And it shocked me because it seemed to be common sense to me that I wasn't getting them to come to my office. I was going to where they were. I was establishing trusted relationships with them and not setting up an infrastructure which shifted the roles of power. They didn't have to come to me. They didn't have to sit behind my desk away from me. They didn't have to feel marginalized and othered. I went to them. I went to trusted spaces in their communities. I built the trust and the bonds, got to know their communities first. And then folks came to me. And so after more than 20 years, it seemed to make sense to me to take this experience elsewhere because it wasn't limited to the gender-based violence sector. It was all over the nonprofit sector, all over corporate America, our society in general, in terms of having really honest conversations about how many varied forms of systemic oppression impact our work, impact our day-to-day interactions with each other, impact our families. Right? And so my partner, Jessica Lee, and I began Healing Equity United in order to support organizations to move beyond awareness towards really sustained action. I will pause here to say that the diversity sector has been around for a minute, and millions of dollars have been poured into that sector. And I will also say that we haven't pushed the needle much, right? And so I think that what we are seeing now is a desire to move past having one token person who checks a variety of boxes, right? Like, the Asian trans man who's left-handed and Muslim, let's hire that person. And now we've achieve diversity. We have to move beyond that. And so that's what my partner and I do or attempt to do with our work. Our work consists of providing technical assistance. So how do you take the theory and make it applicable on a day-to-day basis? Comprehensive training. So we don't do the Starbucks model. And I've coined it the Starbucks model because it seems like, once a year, once every 5 years, there's a PR nightmare. They shut down for a day, they do training, and then they open up the next day and say, see, we fixed the problem, we're done, right? We understand that it's taken hundreds of years to cultivate our unique system of oppression. It is going to take more than a day of training to dismantle it. So in addition to technical assistance and training, we also provide audits. So basically, where is your company or organization now? What kind of policies, practices, and procedures do you have in place that unintentionally, most times, create barriers to accessibility of folks with marginalized identities. And by marginalized identities, I'm not just speaking about in terms of racial lines. I'm talking about, in terms of religion, ability, gender, sexual orientation, sex, race, ethnicity, language, the whole spectrum, right? So we do those three things. We support organizations, and then we do things like this, talking to people. And I'm sorry, my dog is saying hello to the post office. He's less stressed, maybe. So we talk to individuals because we know that it's not just about businesses and companies doing the work. Businesses are made up of people. Volunteer organizations are made up of its volunteers. And so for us, it's really important to engage as many people as possible in having this conversation and getting folks to buy into the notion that we are all change agents, regardless of our ability, regardless of our age, regardless of our race, regardless of our religions, that we are all change agents and can finally shift the needle that I referred to earlier. So I'm going to pause there before I get into diving into privilege and identities and systemic oppression, just to ask if folks have questions about anything that I've shared thus far. And please feel free to put them in the chat, to unmute and ask, to raise your reactions hand, or to send me a direct message if you don't want to ask your question publicly. I'm open to all ways of engagement. Stephanie.
Hi, Fiona. I was just wondering, I really respect your daughter who had decided to identify as a Black woman. How about your other two children? How do they identify, and how did they respond to your daughter's identification?
Thank you for the question. They still consider themselves biracial. And they also consider themselves bicultural. So for them, there is, because my husband only speaks Dutch to them, and so his whiteness is very closely tied in their minds to his Dutchness. And so they view themselves as half Dutch as well. And so the younger two still very much identify as half Black, half white. And the older one understands that as well. Like biologically, she understands she's half Black, half white, but the way she identifies is as a Black woman with a white father, and everybody respects that. But thank you for the question. The youngest is 13 and still trying to find his way. So come back to me in 5 years. We'll see what he says. Anyone else? Your question, Stephanie, does make me think of, and I have the book somewhere here, a wonderful book called One Drop, The Shifting Lens on Race in America. And it is a fascinating book about all of the varied nuance within who is called Black in America, from folks who, yes, thank you so much for putting it in the chat. It is, someone who from all outward appearances appears Asian, and he identifies as Black because he is half Black, and his Asian family never lets him forget that he's half Black. But the way he is perceived and treated in this society is as an Asian person. So he is staunchly like, I am Black, I am Black, I am Black. And so I recommend it to everyone. who wants to find out more about what that shifting lens might look like and how people might identify and how those identifications might differ from how they are perceived by society.
May, I think that doing readings like that one help people to also understand the dynamics of colorism and how, right, people of color, all different shades, and your experience of yourself, your experience of privilege, all of that really does depend in a lot of ways on how dark is your skin. So, and that is, yeah. So that's what you're pointing to. And of course, we can't really talk about that a lot, but I think that a lot of times people of color, and this is one of the things we were talking about, we tend to sometimes look at how we've been marginalized or how we feel marginalized and forget sometimes that there is this privilege depending on how we identify and what we look like to somebody else. So, and that person, that somebody else could be a parent, a relative, somebody of our own race. And so that's just, it's a very interesting dynamic that it's good for white people to learn about, I think.
Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. So Dean, I think I have your name correctly. I see there's a Dean and Joe. I wanted to respond to briefly a direct message that I received asking whether or not my husband felt othered by my daughter's decision regarding how she identifies. No, that's her decision on how to identify, not his. He is her white father. And so that's about how he takes it. So Dean and then Joe, and then let's dive into identities and privilege and unpacking it all. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I was going to do more than, I was just going to listen today, not talk. But I think the age of the African American has a lot to do with the relationship to having white heritage. As a fair-skinned African American who's in my 80s, I sort of share the attitude of Carolyn Randall Williams that I have rape-colored skin. All right. So that my white ancestry does not come from loving consensual relationships. Whereas younger people in an age where whites and blacks can love each other and marry, I think have a different relationship to the whiteness in their genes.
Thank you for saying that. I think that is really profound, because as we examine where we hold power and privilege, we also have to identify that age and our lived experience is one of the identities that's going to impact how we show up in doing this work, right? So I have to be extremely mindful of trying not to project my own perspective on oppression and the oppression that I've faced onto my children. Because hopefully the world is shifting. They will face oppression and have, but it won't necessarily be the exact same as the type that I have faced as an older person in this country. And those experiences were framed by a country that hadn't started to grapple with these conversations and issues. So Joe?
Thank you, Fiona. I would prefer to defer my question until after you finish all of your presentation, if that's okay with you.
That's totally fine. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I'm hoping that I haven't missed anything in the chat, but as I'm speaking, Lane or Eugene, if you see that I've missed something, please interject and let me know. So when I start these conversations, I really think it's important for folks to understand and have uniform messaging, language. So when I talk about privilege, I'm talking about advantages and benefits that are given to some people based on a social identity. And that's it. Now, there are varied forms of privilege, right? I don't know if you want to use your reactions button, but how many lefties are in the group? Left-handed folks. Okay, I see a couple have raised your hands. Okay. For any of the folks who have raised their hands, who are left-handed folks, do you think that being left-handed granted you a privilege in school when you were growing up? I'm seeing vigorous shaking of heads. Right, exactly, right? The privilege was granted to, exactly, I'm seeing it in the chat, scissors were only for right-handed children, right? Writing on the chalkboard. I believe the design of the chalkboard is inherently flawed. Only right-handed people can write on the chalkboard without erasing everything that they've written, right? Sitting in those desks, horrible for paying attention because you had to focus on turning it around and turning upside down. And by the time you got yourself comfortable, the teacher has already moved on to another subject, right? So who had the privilege? The right-handed children. And I use that as a fairly innocuous example to demonstrate that regardless of any of your multitude of identities, there are some in which you're going to hold privilege and some not. The fact that I'm speaking to you all in English, we all speak English, that's a privilege, right? Right-handed folks, innocuous privilege. Being physically able-bodied, that's a privilege. In this country, whiteness or white passing is a privilege, right? And so there are a variety of privileges. There's not just only white privilege that has received a lot of attention, right? But there is privilege in, a multitude of identities that we hold. And why I focus on that is because it creates common ground. As a beginning to be middle-aged, overweight Black woman, right? You can hear a variety of signifiers in those identities that might make you think, oh, she's oppressed. Yes, I do face some oppression in a variety of those identities, but due to my class, I hold privilege. Due to my immigration status, I hold privilege. Due to my education, I hold privilege. Due to my income, I hold privilege. And so I can go through my religion, my sexuality, you can go through the list after list after list of your identities, and you have to determine where and how you hold privilege. In society today, a lot of people feel ashamed, embarrassed, a little ambivalent about discussing their privilege. I don't want to seem as if I'm showing off. I don't want to seem as if I'm better than. I don't want to seem as ... But it's only, from my perspective, it's only where we identify where and how we hold privilege that we can then leverage it in solidarity with others, not to be power over, not to make decisions for, but to work in solidarity with those who do not share your privileged identity in terms of marginalization. So that was a lot, and I sometimes get pushback on who has privilege and who doesn't. I'll give you an example. I was working with an international group, and a Middle Eastern woman who was significantly privileged in her home country, currently works here, and she could not see that she had any privilege. due to her ethnicity and what she faced as an immigrant in this country and how she was treated in the international realm due to her background, she could only see oppression. And in fact, it enraged her that I was pushing this idea that even though she faced oppression, and I'm not trying to minimize it or say it's innocuous or say it doesn't matter, but she could not see the yes and. And I have to say, that is a journey. That to get to that place, for some of us, takes longer than others. So I wanted to be mindful of creating space for us to have a conversation just about that, just about whether or not we can hold varied identities that have power and privilege, as well as possibly those that are associated with oppression. And I feel like I'm missing some spectacular conversation in the chat.
I don't think so. I think people are just commenting on what you're saying. People are talking about the intersection of cisgender straight males, the intersection of race and class, which you just discussed, talking about the invisibility of white privilege to white people mostly, which is our point today, that we need to really check ourselves and see where we're ignoring or disavowing that we have some privilege.
Yeah, that's a great point. But I want to answer any questions first because I want to get into the characteristics of privilege for you. So, Francis, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I think I started that thread by commenting that, that I really get what you're saying about all the different ways that each of us can have privilege, and that we forget, I forget that I'm an able-bodied woman. I really never forget that I'm a woman and, what that means. But I think I started by saying that white male, and then people added cisgender. Privilege is unique in some ways because it's been supportive of the power structures, of the oppressive power structures so completely in the world and in history, whereas the other, more so at a higher level than some of the other identities that result in privilege or lack of it. There's a qualitative difference in white male cisgender privilege, versus ableism. I mean, ableism supports infrastructure that needs to be changed, but there's a way that white male cisgender privilege is a sort of outside and above some of the others.
Thank you for saying that. I think it's an interesting conversation because from my perspective, all oppression is tied. And so for me, one type of oppression, and for me, oppression is the flip side of privilege, right? So for me, there is no distinction between white male cisgender privilege and a white female who identifies as a lesbian's privilege, right? In terms of, there are other factors at play that help to maintain systemic oppression overall, right? And so it's only when each of those groups say, oh, this is how I hold power and privilege. Oh, this is my role in systemic oppression. This is the role that I'm playing in maintaining the system and perpetuating the system. And only when I refuse to play the game might the system be in jeopardy of falling apart. So for me, that white cisgender man and that white, lesbian identified woman and the Black middle-aged overweight woman who's speaking to you all have a role to play in identifying where and how they hold privilege in order for the entire system to crumble. For me, I can't wait for that one group to do its work. We all have to do our work together. So for example, my partner, yes, I love that quote from Sheila, "There's no hierarchy in oppressions," from Audre Lorde. My partner is an Asian American woman, and we often talk about the fact that my privilege is being Black. In a day of anti-Asian hate, when she's sometimes afraid to leave her car if we have to travel for business, then my privilege is I'm not Asian, right? Does that negate what I might face as a Black woman? No. But it recognizes that, you know, in this messed up system of oppression, that each of us has a role to play in dismantling it. I hope that tags along with what you were saying, Francis.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have no, everything that you just said, I totally agree with, but I think there is a point about, you know, left-handed people have participated in the same numbers that they are in the population in the white power structure. They have not been excluded from that power structure. You know, so I just hold it a little differently when I think about history and political realities than, you know, that someone who's left-handed and feels marginalized in certain ways, you know, and disabled, you know, very wealthy, class-privileged, white, disabled people who can afford all the care they need to be able to participate have not, you know, are able to escape that marginalization, whereas, you know, someone with a very visible mark of marginalization is not able to as readily. So,
all very true. But I also believe in like a yes and, right? All very true.
No,
yes
my
and.
comment was really about yes and. It was not about no, but, you know.
So thank you. I see some additional things in the chat in terms of questions. And so I think some of the questions in the chat might be addressed by what I'm about to share in terms of the characteristics of privilege, and then moving into, you know, so what can we do about it? So there are, I would say, about 5 general characteristics of privilege. 1, normalcy, superiority, power, its beneficial nature, and invisibility. So some of us said, I forget who mentioned it. Sometimes I forget that. It might have even been you, Francis. I don't know. So sometimes I forget that, and then you fill in the identity that grants you the privilege, right? Because the privilege is invisible to you. I will say that I was not as mindful of my able-bodied privilege until my mother became wheelchair-bound, right? And then I saw the lack of curb cuts everywhere. And I live in the suburbs. And so we sometimes don't even have sidewalks. I'm like, no, dude, wheelchair-bound folks, get around. Oh my goodness. And then I'm all outraged and indignant. But the fact is that my able-bodiedness made that lived experience and reality invisible to me. It was there before my mom became wheelchair-bound, right? Like that lived experience was there already.
So Ms. Oliphant, would you just go again? Normalcy, superiority, power, and invisibility. That's what
absolutely.
Is that correct? Oh, thank you, Felicia.
Yes, normalcy, superiority, power, invisibility, and it's beneficial in nature.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you both.
And thank you for asking. Let's see who was in the chat. Corinne, thank you, and Felicia for following up. So normalcy, I'll give you an example. So this was back in the day before Uber and Lyft. We're living in New York. I already told you I was in one borough that was very far away in the Bronx. And my then not husband was living down in the village in the lower part of Manhattan. It usually takes a 45-minute to an hour-long train ride plus a 15-minute bus ride for me to get home from where he was living at the time. And one night after a date, I was lazy. I'm going to get a cab. I don't want to deal with the subway and then a bus and then have to walk around the corner. I'm not doing it. I'm getting a cab. So on First Avenue, 45 minutes later, I come knocking on his door. I'm crying. It's now super late. I couldn't get a cab. It's ridiculous. I'm really frustrated. I'm tired and I just want to go home. And he says, what do you mean you couldn't get a cab? There are always tons of cabs on First Avenue. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's just, come with me. And we trot downstairs and he puts his hand out and I kid you not one, not two, but 3 cabs stop in front of him. And he opens the door to one of them and he ushers me in and he says, see, I told you there are always cabs down here. Now, at that point, I couldn't respond because I was like, I'm going to take this man's head off. Despite my nonviolent tendencies, I was willing to give that up. But the normalcy of his lived experience dictated that anyone could lift their hand and get a cab at any time of night on any street. Because that was his normal experience. It didn't occur to him that other folks had other responses to responses from cab drivers when they lifted their hands. He didn't see it, he didn't live it. So normalcy is a characteristic of privilege. Again, when you think about any of your privileged identities, is it normal to have Wi-Fi in your home? Is it normal to have all of the resources available in your children's school? Or do parents have to cobble together their coins to buy the resources to bring to the school? Is it normal to be accessing your voting poll? Is it normal to have enough money to purchase a car or purchase gas or not worry about transportation from your home to your job? Is it normal to have a job? Right? All of those are rooted in our privileges, the normalcy of our lived experiences. Superiority. This one is sensitive. This one is sensitive in nature because you don't talk about this in polite society. You don't admit that, my group is actually, okay, I won't say superior to your group, but your group is not as great as my group, right? If only your group did fill in the blank, then you would have access to these benefits too, right? We don't, it's a faux pas nowadays to say that we're actually superior to that other group, but we still think it, right? We still act on it. We just don't articulate it anymore. But Fiona's here to name it and call it what it is. It is a characteristic of privilege that we are superior to those other people who don't share the same identity and hold the same privilege that we do. Power. We have to name this one. This one is big because I find this in my work that there are a lot of people who are committed to articulating and identifying the problem, right? Oh my goodness, this group is marginalized and this group is oppressed. And then the work has to be done, all right? So what are you going to do? How are you going to share your power? How are you going to step away from your power? How are you going to delegate power? And so, whoa, not so fast. Hold on. Let's not get out of control here. I'm still gonna make the decisions. I'll just help somebody, be a little better than they are today, right? Because we are deeply wed to holding on to our power. Whatever, we are like, as a society, we are crabs in a bucket, right? Like, I don't care who's below me, but I'm going to scrabble to the top and hold on to my power. It's beneficial in nature, obviously. It wouldn't be a privilege if it wasn't, right? And so we have to be honest about that. We have to be honest about the benefits. We have to be honest about, you know, oh, so you don't have my immigration status, and my benefit is I don't have to fear being, you know, taken away by ICE. My fear is I don't have to worry about, you know, my boss firing me or promising to pay me under the table and then not paying me at all. And then I have no recourse because, like, there's a benefit to this privilege. And then the last one, no, I think I covered all of them. So Lisa, I see your hand, and then I see a couple of, Yep, Lisa.
Hi, Fiona.
Hi.
Thanks so much. I love the last point that you were talking about, and that's actually what I had a question about. So I would love to explore, you know, the delicate balance of how we use our privilege for good, you know, and to uplift marginalized populations and not make it about us. So, you know, how do we use our privilege to empower others? Which is just what you were sort of talking about.
Yeah, I think that there are, first of all, thank you for the question. I think that there are a multitude of ways in which to use your privilege. And I think that it is only limited by our lack of imagination. And I would urge people to start local. So if you work in environment and that's your jam, right? Then, you know, leveraging your privilege in that space to have real conversations about who has access to clean water, who has access to water, period, who has the ability to deny a, you know, big highway going straight down the middle of their community and having all kinds of exhaust and fumes coming into their community, right? So it's not, and so that leads me to another thought is that, you know, when we talk about anti-oppression and anti-racism, people often want to put it in a bucket off to the side. And I argue, no, like, we can leverage our privilege wherever we are. If we're a teacher, how are you leveraging your privilege in the classroom? Which students are you calling out? Which resources are you giving out? How are you administering discipline to children? Is that being done equitably? Does there have to be discipline, right? And so, you know, there are a variety of ways in order to leverage the privilege that you have. And I would say that the most important component of leveraging your privilege is to really work in solidarity and engagement with marginalized folks. So I can think I'm leveraging my privilege in the best of ways possible by having like an international potluck, right? And then I talk to some Latina folks in my neighborhood and they're like, that's not really helping me. Thank you very much. Like, you're going to have to show up in a different way than that for me. So asking people what their priorities are, what their suggestions might be, not in a way that puts the onus back on marginalized people to do the work, but to say, I just need guidance so that I can act in solidarity with you and not over you and not, you know, doing my own thing. And I think that feels substantially different of like, I am going to do the work. I just need some guidance from you. I hope that answers your question, Lisa. And then I see Joe and Robert.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you very much for joining us today. This has been another terrific guest appearance. I appreciate your thoughts and comments. Here's my question. I suspect that another privilege that people in white superiority have is the privilege of being comfortable. We expect to be comfortable. We won't tolerate discomfort. So my question to you is, what do you say to people who have an interest in starting the work of dismantling racism, but they are unwilling to suffer discomfort? How do you have that conversation and unveil the need for them to be ready for, you can't do this? without discomfort. You are going to be uncomfortable. If you're going to do this work, if you're serious about this, you're going to be uncomfortable. How might you have that conversation? I would love to be a fly in the wall for one of those.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, look, when I have my trainings, we always start with a set of group agreements. And one of the agreements is that we agree to engage in a brave space, not necessarily a safe space. I never guarantee people that I'm not going to say something that makes them feel uncomfortable or challenged, or, you know, they may want to, oh my goodness, she's going to make me cry because she's making me feel this, that, and the other thing, right? Because we feel that it's in the spaces of discomfort where we have the most growth. But I couch that in that it's not only one group of people's responsibility to be uncomfortable. My approach is that we all need to get uncomfortable. So for example, I carry a little notebook around with me. And I jot down my biased thoughts and prejudices whenever they pop up. And about once a week, once every 2 weeks, I go through them and try to figure out where the root of those biased thoughts came from. And try to unpack them and try to unlearn them. And guess what? This is not my first little book. It's not my second or third either, right? Because once you start unpacking your biases and prejudices, there are a whole heck of a lot more that are out there. And to your point, Joe, does it make me comfortable to tell you all that I have a multitude of little books in which I've filled with my biases and prejudices? No. Does it make me feel nice when I'm exploring the depths of my psyche in all of the ways that I uphold systemic oppression? No. But we can't do this work unless we get honest with ourselves and we get real and get uncomfortable to do the work. So I hope that answers your question.
And I want to add something to that. You know, this is Eugene speaking. One of the things, you know, to go into Joe's question, right, is learning how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, and that takes courage.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Robert.
So, Robert.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So thank you for sharing your thinking and thoughts today, Fiona. My question is, in addition, in your thinking, because that people basically are parts of different groups or subcultures or whatever, but that relative to a particular other one, you can have privilege or be oppressed, or just be. My question is, in your thinking, how have you dealt with people feeling threatened? Which in my mind is not about ignorance and not about fear in the usual sense, but like what happened to the guy that killed George Floyd. I felt like he went from just being a police officer to a place of threat where he basically lost his mind and decided, hey, I can just kill this guy. Or what I've seen in my own personal experience, where a number of middle-class Black people I know got stopped by the police for no reason. I mean, absolutely no reason, even in a liberal city. And so this idea of feeling threatened, because I have a few prejudices that persist, and where it's irrational, kind of like, being afraid of a caterpillar or something, but it's strong. And so I'm wondering, and I have a feeling that that's what some people have, and they act on it and they wipe out folks. So what's your thinking on how does threat fit into your thinking?
Thank you for the question, Robert. And so for me, I put that in the context of how I unpack and understand bias. And so a large part of bias, and bias is a whole biological thing, and we all have bias and da 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 da. But bias is exacerbated, and we lean into and lean on bias at a far greater rate when we are facing the unknown, when we have a very limited period of time and we have to make a snap decision, and when we feel quote unquote threatened. And I think the unknown and the threatened are linked together. And so, for example, you know, I might see a group of people and think, well, actually, I will tell you, I was attending a national conference. We were speaking, and it was in Philadelphia, and I had to walk underneath a tunnel to get to the hotel. And while I was walking, I suddenly found myself in the middle of the street. And I stopped in the middle of the street and I said, Fiona, what are you doing? Because the hotel was on the same side of the street that I was originally on. What are you doing? And I looked back and I realized that there was an encampment of homeless or houseless men on the side of the street that I was walking on. Innately, my body, before my mind could catch up, saw a threat. Right? My body acted on that perceived threat from fear and started to walk away. My rational mind took a minute to catch up and then said, hold the phone. What is going on? I did a quick assessment. No one seemed to be belligerent. No one seemed to be aggressive. No one seemed to have any obvious weapons. And so I went back to the side of the street that I was originally on and I walked by them. You know what happened? Have a good evening, ma'am. Get home safely, ma'am. Take care now. And so to answer your question, I think that we can all act on those perceived threats. We can act on that fear, but I really think it's a root of a lot of our biases. And so at least for me, a better practice is trying to distinguish bias from real threat, right? And sometimes I might get that wrong. But at least for me, that's the practice that I try to uphold on a daily basis of where is this my bias and where is this somebody who might actually do me physical harm. And I think that we can all do that on a daily basis. Avril, I hope I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah, Avril.
Avril.
Thank you for this. I wanted to back up for a second and look at the normalcy and look at ways that people of color could be more of an ally or help out white folks around some of the normalcy that comes up. Is there particular practices that you've used in the past to help people see that? Or is it something around maybe like journaling around their lived experiences?
That's a great question. And I think I shouldn't say only, but that practice may be greatly enhanced by us knowing each other more and better. Like when you look at the percentages of white folks who know and are friendly with and have more than acquaintances of people of color, it's a minuscule percentage, right? And so if you live in an all-white bubble, then your normal lived experiences become the only lived experiences. And it's only until you start to engage with folks who are other than you that you see, oh, well, for example, like I told you, I worked in the anti-domestic violence sector, and we had a lot of cases that engaged in the child welfare system, right? And so, sometimes folks in the child welfare system would go into the home, do assessments, da, 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 da. Well, we had to do a lot of training around what a normal family composition looked like, right? Because some folks would go into the home and see an overcrowded home, and this must be poor for the child. But what they failed to see was that it was an intergenerational home that was normal for the culture of the family that lived in it, right? And what they perceived was an aberration from the norm of having a nuclear family of your parents and your children and a pet, maybe, and that's it, right? And so it's only with exposure to other norms, other frames of normalcy, that you can start to shift the lens on how you view what's normal. I can only tell for example, I can only tell my husband so much of my lived experience for him to start shifting what he views as normal. And then I'd be very, very tired, and I'd be speaking until the day I was dead, right? Like the list goes on and on and on. So I think it has to be more engagement.
More immerging yourself in the culture kind of thing.
Yes, yes.
I think.
Yeah, absolutely, everyone.
I'm going to go back to a word. By the way, I really love your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to a word you used about a half an hour ago. It was share. And it's a one that I think about a lot in terms of how we start to turn the United States around, if we're ever going to be able to. And I think we are faced not just with the Trumpians, but I think there are a lot of well-meaning liberal white people who will go only so far, but really don't want to let go of dominance and really don't want to start sharing. You know, we're taught in kindergarten to share, but by third grade, we've figured out that's not how you get ahead. All right. And I'm really concerned that at a very micro level, we can get to know each other and it's sort of superficial, but the understanding is that I'm going to be on top and you're going to be on the bottom. And this pushback we're seeing that's so ugly in the country now is, no, I never intended to share. Now, obviously, we are not going to take over. There's simply not enough of us. And we're not in a position of enough power to do it. But we do want more sharing in the democracy. And even that sharing piece is upsetting a lot of whites.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Look, I've told people that this is a natural backlash, what we're experiencing now. It's a very natural backlash because it's a shifting of a pre-existing paradigm and power structure. And folks, whoa, that's not what I intended. You know, like, and it was a direct, it had a direct correlation to President Obama, you know, coming into office. It's like, wait, I was okay with Black senators and Congress people, like even a Black colleague. I don't know how I feel about having a Black president, right? And so there was a backlash of sense of, okay, so now I have to reassert my dominance and reassert my power and hold on to it even tighter. But look, at least from my perspective, and I'm an eternal optimist, as was said in my bio. I mean, why else would I do this work and work in the anti-violence sector if I didn't believe that we could ultimately change? So I believe that progress is continuing to move forward. I think what we are experiencing now is a natural backlash to that progression forward. But I think that ultimately we will continue to see momentum forward. The conversations that I hear my 17-year-old having and my 13-year-old having are so advanced on these topics. It's like, okay, I started to maybe think about this when I was 20, right? And so I have really deep faith that we are going to push through this, you know, and I believe in nonviolence, but you know, there's a certain element of, if you don't want to share power, then move aside because people are taking power, right? Like, so we can do this the collaborative way, or you can get out of the way. And so I think that that is where society is moving, and not just along the lines of race. I'm talking about in terms of like non-binary folks, in terms of like folks of different religions, of like, so you can try to take my rights away. That's okay. You do you, but we're still going to move forward, and we're still going to take what we need. I hope that answers your question. And then Greg and Laura, and I think some things in the chat. Greg.
Thank you, Fiona. I really enjoyed your conversation, your presentation. I wanted to comment on what Adine said. I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. I'm a white male. I do not want to give up my power. But it makes no difference because I can't give up my power. I can work collaboratively, as we've been talking. I think that's the direction we're going. And I think Fiona just a moment ago summed it up well. We are moving. The tide of society is moving in a direction. And I'm spending a lot of my retired time on this topic. Yet, you're right. I can't give up my power. I can't. I'm giving away money. I'm doing some things and researching and trying to, you know, be a part of the conversation and do my small part. But yeah, it's really a societal change that we're looking at individually, you know, playing out individually. But I struggle with that too, because I can't really give up my power. It's been ordained because of all the many things I have. I've been writing down: white, heterosexual, male, U.S. citizen, healthy, English speaker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really getting much more in tune with how much privilege I have.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing that and putting it out there. So look, I think there are a couple of things, and there is some nuance as to how we use the word power, right? So there is the power that is attributed to you by society, right? And then there's the power that you have, right? And so, you know, you can do whatever the heck you want with your power. It might, like Dr. Benita Love in one of her interviews says, you know, whiteness is like an ATM. It keeps on refilling. Like, you can make a withdrawal on your whiteness, and then it keeps on replenishing, and you can share your power and share your power and share your power. And you can keep getting it back, keep getting it back, keep getting it back. And so it's about, so for example, I was the executive director of the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Research Project. And by the name, you can tell we serve primarily Asian and Pacific Islanders. It didn't feel right being the director for over 2 years of an organization that primarily served people who did not look like me, I did not share their culture, right? Particularly when there are folks in the community who could do a great job, right? So what did I ask the board to do? Find somebody from the community to do the job. I walked away from the job. Now, I will grant you that I could do that because of a variety of privileges I have: financial, class, ability to start my own thing, get another job, whatever. But that is walking away from power, right? And so I would just argue about the nuance of how we use the word power. Is it the power that folks bestow on you from the outside, or is it the power that you actually have? The power you actually have, you can do anything you like with it. All right, Laura, Felicia, Karen.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying your talk. I'm a retired public school teacher of 38 years, and as a teacher, I felt I could make a difference in how history was taught and bring in a broader scope for Native Americans, for Hawaii, for Sadako and 1,000 Paper Cranes, many things. And I was hopeful when more history, the full history, the real history, the face of rape, the taking down of statues began to happen. And now I'm really so appalled that there's laws being made and people rallying behind not teaching real full history. And I'm so angry about that. I think we're moving forward. I think we're changing. And then there's such a huge and powerful, I don't know what to call it, you know, movement against that.
Thank you for sharing that, Laura. So look, systemic oppression and its varied forms, racism being one of the most egregious, is powerful in the fact that it is like a chameleon. So whenever its existing form is too offensive for society, it changes its permutation, it changes its skin color. I'm talking about the chameleon, not ours, right? It changes how it can blend so that it can ultimately remain in place. So what you're talking about has always been done, right? We've always done this, right? Folks have always created histories and her stories that have benefited and uplifted some and excluded and rendered invisible others, right? And so we've all, now folks are just being a little bit more blatant about it, right?
And it's wonderful.
Well, it for me, it's wonderful because now we can name it, right? Nobody was concerned when all these people of color and marginalized identities were left out of history books before. Nobody was talking about that except the marginalized people. But now we're having a conversation about, so we're not gonna mention the whole thing about XYZ, right? That's what we're doing today. Okay, just to be clear. Right? But now we can have that conversation. Now we can identify it and grapple with it and articulate that this, the attempted legislation around critical race theory, about the voter laws and who can vote and who shouldn't, about what's being taught in classrooms, all of this is a way to try to maintain control, as I think it was Dean was talking about earlier, and to shift the conversation, right? And to control the narrative. But at least now we are seeing it. It's in broad daylight and we can all speak on it. I know that we only have 12 minutes left, Lane and Eugene. So love to get to Felicia, Karen, and if there's anything in the chat that I've missed that we would love to address.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I have to say, I want to start by appreciating your optimism around this. I have been living and teaching diversity before people were talking about diversity. And now all of a sudden, everybody wants diversity, equity, and inclusion training. But what I'm finding is people want a Band-Aid. They want a quick fix. They want the checklist. They want to be able to say, we took this training once and now we've got it and we don't need to talk about that anymore. Like you say, the Starbucks model. It's like, oh, there's a problem, we addressed it, but it's really back to normal. So my question is for us to, on the level that we work in, for each of us where we live, whether it's in our organization or our spiritual community, what's the path to really making change at the, not changing the whole global system or breaking down systemic racism as a society, but your point is that each of us can make a difference where we are. Can you give us some tips or direction to be able to address it so that it's lasting change, as opposed to the make people feel better with a quick fix and a couple of check boxes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's really the crux of my work, right? And that's what I find to be most difficult about this work, and you might as well, is that I'm asking people to be perpetually uncomfortable. I'm asking people to be continuously self-reflective and to analyze how they are perpetuating oppression. I am asking people not to point the finger at others, but to look in the mirror and ask, what am I doing that contributes to this? And that doesn't make people feel good. But I think that that is the only solution because, you know, there was I had a recent conversation with someone and we were talking about, you know, she wanted to do some change and I said, okay, so who's gonna be your accountability partner? You know, who's going to be your checks and balances to ensure that you are remaining true to your aspirations? And with a completely straight face, she said to me, I am my best accountability partner. I was like, no. You're the best barometer of your lived experience and truth, right? You can do that. But after you look inward, then you take action, you also need others who are going to say, we got to call you in or we got to call you out. So I think to answer your question, those for me are the three key steps to moving beyond the checklist. One is the continuous self-reflection about your own role in systemic oppression. Two, taking action, and I would say in solidarity with those who are marginalized with different identities than yours. And then three, to be held accountable, hopefully by those with the marginalized identities, to say when you're getting off track or not, when you are centering yourself again, instead of centering those who are currently marginalized in a variety of spaces.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful.
Karen, you have the penultimate word because then we're going to the chat. Karen?
Oh, Karen? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I missed my name. I just wanted to say that I want to go back to something that Greg and Adine were both saying, because I feel that the survival instinct is so much a part of this whole thing with our identity and how we speak and so forth and so on. And as an 83-year-old woman in this society, I feel immensely privileged, and for lots of reasons. But I serve on one municipal planning committee, and on that committee, I'm the old lady. And I am very careful what I say on that committee because of the fact that I don't want to be viewed as so obsolete that nobody's going to listen to me in the future. So I'm just using that as one very small example because I fear for our country that we're talking about a white male establishment that is fearful of losing. And when you mentioned Barack Obama before, of course, we now recognize, those of us who were so thrilled that we had this wonderful president, and now we know that so much of America was in fear of losing whatever privilege they had because of him. So that is my big concern as far as our society, our country is concerned, and privilege and lack thereof.
Thank you, Karen. I think you raised an excellent point in that we are often afraid to say what we really think for fear of alienating folks or upsetting folks or losing some form of respect that we have in society, whichever positions that we might have. But if there was ever a time in history when we cannot be silent, it is now. It is now. Not to raise our voices in a way that's accusatory and violent and angry and demoralizing, but to raise our voices in a unified way to say we can do better than this. We can do better. Not that we are better than this, because obviously we aren't, but we can do better than this. And that we don't have to continue to adhere to the old normal, right? When people say we're going to get back to normal, I'm like, I don't want to get back to normal. Normal wasn't working so well for some of us, right? So let's reimagine a new normal, and to raise our voices now. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem. Before we get to Tyrone, Lane and Eugene, do we have sufficient time? Is there anything in the chat that should be addressed?
We really don't have a lot of time. Eugene, should we just allow our beloved brother Tyrone to have the last question, and then you have to absolutely be the last question, bro?
Yes. Go ahead, T.
Good morning, Fiona. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. To that last point that was being made by Karen, it's interesting that humility is a very important key, I think. And I learned from a very wise person named Dr. Felicia Williams-Cozy that you have to understand that the ouches, you know, and then be able to speak, you know, say, hey, I may make a mistake, but this is what I'm trying to say, or this question I'm trying to ask. But my question is this, and it's about reparations. So through your lens of privilege and white privilege and this discussion about that, how does reparations fit in? Because it seems to me that that's the point where a lot of people say, oh, whoa, wait a minute. You know, I'm fine to go along and support you. I give some money to the NAACP, but you talk about me giving up some money, now we're gonna have a different conversation. So
right.
What's your take on that?
You know, my take on it is nuanced and complex because, quite frankly, I don't know that there's enough currency right now to. No, I'm in all honesty. Right. In all honesty, if we're going to have a conversation about reparations, about what is due, how long it's been due, and the interest, the accrued interest on what is due in today's dollars, I don't know that we have enough money to do that. And so let's have some other conversations. Is it around reclaiming land for indigenous folks that was taken away from their communities? Is it around reclaiming land that was taken away from Black folks? Is it about, you know, addressing what happened in Tulsa and like recreating communities in which Black excellence and professionalism and wealth is replicated? Like, for me, I'm open to having any and all of those conversations, but if it's, you know, give me $1 for the hundreds of years of X, Y, and Z, there aren't enough of your coins to do that. Like, I don't know. And I understand that that is a controversial approach to this. And I understand that there are a variety of different ways that reparations can take effect. So, for example, some of these Ivy League institutions saying to descendants of enslaved folks that you can attend our institutions free of charge due to X, Y, and Z. Like, there are a variety of ways that it can manifest in society. I don't know.
I guess my greater point was understanding just people acknowledging that, even having a discussion about it. And I think that's a hurdle that we haven't even quite had yet. You know, it's something. I guess that's what I'm saying. And I think the reaction to it is one that is very palatable when you're looking at what we're talking about, you know, at land, whatever the case. I'll end it there, but I just want to thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. And I have to say thank you to all of you for such wonderful questions, for such an engaging conversation. I hope that it was helpful. I hope that it was food for thought, and for future conversations that you continue to have. So thank you. Eugene and Lane?
Thank you, Fiona, for being here. Eugene, is it okay? I just want to tell people who we've got up next week.
Yeah, but before you do that, Lane, real fast, I just want to personally say, Fiona Oliphant, thank you so much for being here and spreading the knowledge that you have here with Race Talk Revolution. Watching the chats, man, it's been a beautiful, beautiful experience of growth and people being uncomfortable. It was really, really good.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Thank you.
You brought so much. And I want to ask just who's got a different sense of privilege now after having heard and participated in this conversation?
Absolutely.
Don't be shy, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
Thanks for showing up and digging in, you guys. I want to also put again in the chat that there is a conversation that Braver Angels is hosting on this Thursday night from 8 to 10. And that is called a national debate, Racism in America. And this is answering the question, is America a racist nation? So you do need to register, but I recommend that you please do that. And also next week, we are going to have an interfaith panel discussion. And we're going to be talking about the role of religion and religious leaders in perpetuating and dismantling systemic racism. And so our panelists are going to share their perspectives on that subject and their experiences, faith leaders in doing anti-racism work. And we'll also discuss ways to start conversations for inclusion and racial justice in our faith communities. All right. And our next week is going to be our last episode for this 8-week series. And so please don't miss it. We have a wonderful lineup for you coming up starting in August. We have a couple of slots left. And if you know somebody that you think we should be talking to, that the world needs to hear from, we would be happy to give them a platform. So please just email me at lane@lanecobb.com and we're going to, we will reach out to them. Thank you for your continued support. And we love you all. Fiona Oliphant, thank you. You have been absolutely fabulous. And we hope that you will come back and continue this very important conversation.
Thank you again for having me. Thank you all.
Have a great week, folks.
Thank you.